everyone. Welcome to Amrita Civil Service Academy and welcome to Mains Master Program. So from today onwards, you would be getting 2 questions on a daily basis from different subjects, and you will be getting a detailed answer discussion video based on that question. So this is the first set in that series. So today we would be discussing 2 questions in polity. Okay, so let's jump into the question. So the question is, discuss the extent to which basic structure doctrine has infused an element of rigidity to the Indian Constitution. So I would be taking this answer through multiple steps in a systematic manner. So the first thing we have to know is to understand the question or decode the question or get the question right. Okay, so that is the first thing. So here there is a keyword discuss. So let us keep it aside for a moment. Then let us see the extent to which. So that is the first thing you have to focus on, the extent to which basic structure doctrine. So the question is about basic structure doctrine. That is what we are understanding from it. And the question asks us to identify to what extent basic structure doctrine has infused an element of rigidity. So when we see this element of rigidity, we should be recalling something from the Constitution, right? It is that particular salient feature of the Indian Constitution, which says that Indian Constitution is a unique blend of flexibility and rigidity. So that should come to your mind. So the question is asking you to examine in the context of basic structure doctrine, the principle of flexibility and rigidity, to what extent that balance has shifted, or the balance between flexibility and rigidity shifted in favor of rigidity or otherwise. So that is what we are trying to understand here. So, and the first thing, the extent to which. So this is a very repeated term that you will see in UPSC question papers. Normally either the extent to which or how far. Okay, how far has something happened? So that kind of question setting also can be seen in UPSC. So both these ideas means you have to look on both sides of the thing. So to what extent basic structure doctrine infused an element of rigidity implies to some extent basic structure doctrine has infused an element of rigidity, whereas to some other extent it hasn't. So that going to the complementarities, or you have to think in terms of that complementarity whenever you see the term to what extent or to how far. So that is about the question or understanding the question in general. Then the key term discuss. It's very often seen in UPSC questions. By discuss, only thing you have to keep in mind is that it's just discussing on that topic, just like we discussed this idea among we friends. Okay, so that is one useful analogy you can have. So when we are discussing a topic between us, for example, has basic structure doctrine infused an element of rigidity between myself and some of you, if you're thinking in that sense, so I might say that yes, basic structure doctrine has infused some element of rigidity, for example, as we can see in such and such case. But on the other hand, we can equally see that whenever there were requirements of flexibility, basic structure doctrine allowed for that. So that would be my point. So, and somebody would also be adding 2 more points to it. So that is the kind of way we discuss things, right? So even in UPSC, that is the same idea. So you are just navigating through different arguments in the context of the questions. That's all you have to take from the keyword discuss. So that is about understanding the question in general. Now we move to the next stage, that is getting a structure for the question. Or after once you understand the demand of the question, you try to put that demand in a structured manner. So from here onwards, whenever you start writing an answer, this should either happen in a literal way, you have to structure it on a piece of paper, or it should eventually start happening in your mind. Okay, so let us jump to the manner to structure this answer. So as always, the structure would have 3 components. It would have an introduction, it would have a body, it would have a conclusion. So when I am listing out the structure, I won't go into the content, but I would say what should be the contents that should come at different parts. Okay. So first we'll start with intro. Okay. So coming or talking about basic structure doctrine, we know that's a technical term, right? So it's a judicially innovated idea. So it's not something a layman can easily understand. So it makes perfect sense for us to define what basic structure means. So whenever in the context of UPSC answers, if you try to define something, you have to recall the Three Idiots example where Amir Khan and Chatur is engaging in a definition kind of a thing in the class, right? So we want the Amir Khan definition of things. We don't want the Chatur thing. We don't want that textbookish, too rigid kind of a definition. And it's often very difficult to by heart and reproduce that kind of definition also. So for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of understanding, it is always better to have a working definition. So definition should always be a easy to understand working definition. Define basic structure doctrine. So that is the first thing you would say. Maybe you could give an example also. For example, once you define, you could say federalism or secularism or judicial independence. Any of this is part of basic structure doctrine. So that makes the first part of your introduction. But that's not all. So introduction in UPSC or introduction anywhere means a preface to your rest of the content, the remaining content. You should help the examiner understand what is going to follow. Okay, by reading your introduction, the examiner should understand what you have made out of the question. Or to put it simply, you have to show the examiner that you understood the demand of the question properly and you are going to respond accordingly in the corresponding lines. So obviously, once you define in a one line or something, the next thing what you can say is that what would be your overall approach to this answer? That is something you can present in the introduction. So the examiner would know what to expect, right? So in questions like this, what is the kind of approach? So most of the situations when it comes to UPSC answer writing, we take the Buddhist middle path. Okay, that is our most preferred strategy. Whenever you are in doubt, you go for the Buddhist middle path when it comes to UPSC answers. So here we know that basic structure doctrine, it's a positive thing, right? Most of us agree with it. Most of the academicians have defended it. So it's overall a positive thing. But rigidity is a negative thing, especially when it comes to constitution. So when you are asked that basic structure increase the rigidity, you're not going to say that basic structure has infused so much rigidity and Indian constitution is long dead or things like that. That's not how you're going to put your answer, right? But you would say that but on the other hand, we also know that the basic structure doctrine, real practice has brought in some elements of rigidity, right? That is also there. Then how do we balance both? We would say that though basic structure has infused some amount of rigidity, but it hasn't prevented the Indian constitution to respond to changing circumstances, or it hasn't prevented the progress of Indian constitution to reflect the changing circumstances or anything, right? So that is the basic gist that is a basic approach or the feel or the tone, however you call it, that should be part of your answer. So the second line could be saying the impact of basic structure doctrine on that salient feature of constitution, right? Impact of basic structure doctrine on the principle of unique blend of or balance between flexibility and rigidity. Okay, you could mention about the impact of basic structure doctrine on balance between. So it should be a middle path, right? That is the most important thing there. Then we move to the body of the answer. So since we have already decided what our approach would be, and we have to know that since the question as to what extent we have to give both sides of it, that is also understood. Now we would say to some extent BSD has imposed rigidity, but to a larger extent it has allowed for enough flexibility. So I think that is one thing we can agree on, right? That's a broad consensus with which we can move from here. So I would say you can have two major headings in your body paragraph. One could broadly be thought of as argument for rigidity. So I don't think you have to even write these headings, and it's fine if you write this also, both is fine. So here you have to what you have to focus is that you should be putting very less points in the argument for rigidity, right? But the next stage, we should be putting more points. So here, maybe you could put 2 points. Example is very important. You close it down. Then you move to argument against rigidity. Argument against rigidity. Right? Here you should have 3-4 points with examples. So a logical conclusion that should proceed from these two approaches would be that overall it is more flexible rather than rigid, or in other words, basic structure doctrine has brought in small rigidity but enough flexibility. That is the tone you can get, right? So that any logical person would draw like that. If you have 2 arguments for rigidity and 4 arguments for flexibility, then overall it's flexible. So that's a conscious choice we are bringing, right? So if it's an academic literature in EPW or something, they could bring about n number of points for rigidity and things like that. But that's not our idea here, right? We are going for a balanced approach. So we consciously put 2 points here and 4 points down below. Okay, so we make that case. Now we move to the conclusion part, but I don't think you can see here. So conclusion would be a positive thing. So based on all these things, you can kind of put this idea in a different way in the conclusion, right? Because that thing remains. So we have to maybe mention the larger context in which basic structure doctrine, not the entire genesis of it. You can just say that, basic structure doctrine came about just to preserve Indian constitution or preserve certain fundamental features of Indian constitution. The idea was never to stall the progress of Indian constitution. And likewise, that's what has happened over the times also. But some issues has crept into the entire idea. For example, you could give some example here, but that has to be appropriately looked into and corrected in the interest of larger Indian constitutionalism and things like that, and you can conclude. Okay, so conclusion should be again a recap of the entire feel or entire tone of the answer we have been giving so far. So the conclusion will also mean the same thing. So overall, the answer is being reiterated at different points. You give the introduction, you say the gist, then you give 2 arguments with examples, and conclusion, you are again reiterating the same point. So the examiner feels like strongly argued answer, right? With enough examples, enough points to justify your arguments. It's all there, right? So there is no other way other than to guarantee you the maximum possible mark, provided you present it in a much better way than the messy handwriting I have. I think that would also count. The handwriting is really important. You give enough spacing, all those things are important, right? So now we move to the major content of the answer. So this was the overall structure you should have. So from here onwards, make it a practice to devote some time to structure your answer like this. Until you start getting the structure internally, you have to write it down on a piece of paper. Okay, so now let us jump into the major content of the answer. So it's upon us to just put points into the structure we have already laid out. So starting with the introduction again, you're supposed to give a definition. So one thing you have to note when you're writing an answer is that there should always be certain keywords in your answer which an examiner can easily relate to. Okay, because it would be those terms would be, or those ideas would be expressed in that way in government documents or in literature and things like that. So whenever I'm writing, I would mention some keywords. Do write it down. So when it comes to Keshavananda Bharati judgment, or basic structure doctrine, so how should the definition go? Okay, first thing, it should state that it's a judicially innovated doctrine which came about as part of the Keshavananda Bharati case 1973. Very important, judicially innovated doctrine, right? It's a judicially innovated doctrine. So that has to be written. It's not there in the constitution. It's not something legislature brought it out. It's a judicially innovated doctrine. Okay. So that should be written down. That came out as part of the Keshavananda Bharati case 1973. So these are all factual things which should fetch you some mark, or it should impress the examiner that you know stuff properly. Okay. So judicially innovated doctrine, which states that certain elements of the constitution cannot be amended by Parliament even under its constitutional power under Article 368. Okay, so that is the first sentence you can write. So judicially innovated doctrine which came out as part of Keshavananda Bharati case, which state that the Indian Parliament or Indian Constitution has certain basic elements, and these basic elements of Indian Constitution cannot be amended even by Parliament under Article 368, even by a Parliament with brute majority by using Article 368. Okay, so that is the definition of basic structure doctrine, and you could give an example. Okay, federalism has been earmarked as a basic structure doctrine by Supreme Court, or secularism has been declared as a basic structure doctrine by Supreme Court under S.R. Bommai case, or something. Any of these things can be given an example. Then you write the second statement. Coming to the question, so the question of whether Keshavananda Bharati, I'm going into Keshavananda. So the question of whether basic structure doctrine has infused an element of rigidity into the constitution. So we could say that the basic structure doctrine has infused a certain element of rigidity into the Indian constitution, it has never been significant enough to prevent the progress of constitution, or prevent evolution of constitution to reflect the changing priorities and changing circumstances. Okay, so though some rigidity has been infused, but it was never significant enough to prevent the constitution from evolving to the changing times. Okay, so that sums up the overall approach or overall feel that would be there in your answer, right? Then we move to the body. Okay, so though rigid but not significant enough. Okay, so you might feel that it's not here, it's not there. So, but that is what you call by middle path. By middle path, we means you are never here or there. Okay, you just stay in the middle. That is the idea. So, moving to body paragraph. So, here is an example. Here is a definition with major keywords, and we move to the body paragraph. Okay, now you could maybe just recall the previous scenario. So I would like it to put it like this. So prior to basic structure, the Indian Parliament has unlimited powers of amending the constitution under Article 368, only limited by the requirement of certain majorities, like special majority with sanction of states, etc. Okay, so that was the situation prior to basic structure doctrine. But with the arrival of basic structure doctrine, Indian Parliament, no matter how brute a majority it has, it can never amend certain essential features of the constitution, such as federalism, secularism, balance between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy, the principles of judicial independence, the idea of welfare state, rule of law, etc. So now here you could bring so much of parts of basic structure doctrine also. So that is the, sorry, I forgot to write it here. So that is the first argument for rigidity, right? So prior to basic structure, Indian Parliament, if it had enough majority, it could amend any part of the constitution to suit the changing requirements or changing conditions that emerge. But after basic structure came into scene, Indian Parliament, despite, even though it has a brute majority, it cannot amend certain vital essential features of the constitution, such as give 5 or 6 examples, that's all fine. So that is the first argument. What is the second argument? Some critics opine that, or some critics are of the opinion that this rigidity enforced by basic structure doctrine has led to or has prevented Indian constitution from evolving to changing circumstances. So you might think this is kind of going against this point, but that is fine at this point because we are going to go against that, right? So So, or maybe you can give it as a case also, or example also. So we could say that even when the entire system of legislature in this country, that is both the union parliament and 50% of the states, they brought out an act to change the way in which judges are appointed in this country, uh, quoting or taking recourse in basic structure doctrine, judiciary rendered that act unconstitutional, right? So that is again showing. So once you write that, you could say that this again shows Keshava basic structure doctrine has brought in or has prevented Indian constitution from evolving, which is clearly an example of rigidity happening. Okay, so that could be the first thing. Second thing, first is about normally Indian parliament cannot undo certain things. Second is a specific case, which is about National Judicial Appointments Commission. Okay, you can specifically state that. So these are the two arguments for rigidity you can give. Now you move to the other side of it, argument against rigidity. So first thing, so when did this basic structure came into being? It came in 1973, right? So just recall or just think for yourself the important amendments that came out after 1973. And you could show that, or you could use that an example to prove that the constitution is not rigid, just some critics make us to think. So we could say that many significant amendments, such as the 42nd Amendment, which is often termed as a mini constitution, the 44th Amendment, which significantly changed our constitution, happened after the basic structure doctrine. And the coming of 73rd and 74th Amendment, that is the introduction of third layer of Panchayati Raj and urban local bodies, or a significant set of legislations to bring about our LPG reforms, the liberalization, privatization, globalization reform. There were many legislative changes to make this happen, right? That also came into being. So you have to know that all of this LPG particularly came into being, especially when welfare state is also a part of the basic structure. So just see the irony. So you are shifting to a neoliberal mechanism even when you are having welfare state as a basic structure doctrine or as a basic structure of the Indian constitution. So having that didn't prevent the Indian parliament from making these vital changes to the way in which we handle our economy, right? So it shows that basic structure is not a significant barrier. That was our first point for flexibility or argument against rigidity. We saw that there had been many significant amendments to the Indian constitution even after basic structure came into being. So it's very important you give particular examples, right? 42nd, 44th, 73rd, 74th, then the GST. So these are all significant amendments. None of this was hindered by virtue of the basic structure doctrine. So that is the first point. So the second point is that the basic structure doctrine itself is loosely defined. Okay, so there is no clear definition to the idea of basic structure. So the judiciary says that they would see it on a case-by-case basis, right? So how can you say that a doctrine, when itself is loosely defined or when itself is flexible in interpretation or in its approach, how can you say that such a doctrine can infuse or impose rigidity on the constitution, right? So since basic structure itself is loosely defined, it can't be, or it can't be a logical assertion, or you can't make a logical point that this loosely defined basic structure doctrine can be a matter of significant rigidity on the constitution. Second thing. The third thing is that the Supreme Court, it's a revisory body, right? So the Supreme Court can revisit its own judgments. It can revisit its own errors if it has made by appointing a higher bench. That's all that is required for Supreme Court to revisit its earlier judgments. So since a mechanism of revision is very inbuilt into the institutional structure of Supreme Court, if basic structure doctrine has infused a rigidity into the constitution, by now we would have seen a higher bench of Supreme Court being formed and the doctrine could have been removed. Or even the parliament could make a legislation to undo the basic structure doctrine, which would again come into the domain of judiciary, legislature, dynamic. But we see none of those efforts to remove the idea of basic structure doctrine from Indian Constitution. We don't see that initiative coming from the judiciary, which has brought in the idea, but we even don't see that happening from the legislature or executive, which are very often at the receiving end of this basic structure doctrine also. So it is no one's point that basic structure doctrine has imposed rigidity to the Indian Constitution. See, now you have three major points, right? So one is about significant amendments carried out. Then basic structure itself is loosely defined. Then Supreme Court can revisit. Maybe you can give it as a third point. Neither executive nor legislature has made efforts to bring the earlier status quo, you could say, or revisit the judgment. Particularly, the legislature can, if they wish to, they can make changes by bringing in another legislation, right? But no such initiative has happened so far. So you have two arguments which says that it has brought in some amount of rigidity, but four arguments which says that no, there is still scope for so much flexibility. The Constitution is still able to change or evolve with the changing circumstances. I guess now it's amply clear. It is just a 10-marker question. You have given sufficient enough points. Now then you move to the concluding remarks or conclusion. So here I would give you different scenarios. You could conclude with any of these statements. Any of these ideas should suffice. Because it's a 10 marker. If it's a 15 marker, you could come up with 2 or 3 dimensions of it. So first of all, what you have to see is that basic structure doctrine, if you see the genesis of basic structure doctrine, you could see that it was never been the Supreme Court's intention to stall the progress of Indian Constitution, but it was an attempt to save the Indian democracy from a majoritarian government. Okay, so that is one conclusion you can say. So the genesis of basic structure doctrine does not show any intention to forestall or stall the progress of Indian Constitution, but it was only to save the Indian democracy from majoritarianism. Or in other words, you can say that basic structure doctrine has and still act as a safety valve against majoritarianism. Majoritarianism or authoritarian politics. So after Indira Gandhi's government during those 1973, now we have the Modi government. Both the governments had significant majority. They could have tried to undo the essentials of Indian Constitution, right? So if they try, and because they have the numbers to do it, but they can't do because this basic structure remains. So Indian democracy has basically been preserved for infinite, or for the destiny, or maybe for its ever continuing time by virtue of this basic structure doctrine. That is one way you can see it. So I think that is a major things. One is it's a safety valve against majoritarianism, or you could also say that very often the supporters of this argument says that it is the case that saved Indian democracy, the Keshavananda Bharati case. Or you could say that basic structure doctrine is that particular doctrine which saved the Indian democracy. So, but it's equally important for you to mention that. But the case of NJAC, where the Supreme Court didn't go by the interest of the larger legislature in this country, it has more to do with the government, the judiciary's lack of trust in the government, rather than any attempt to change what, to change or bring in that much needed amendment. So, or in other words, what you can say that the issue of NJSC has to be seen as an exception. It should not be taken as a norm. And the NJSC case, the Supreme Court would have rendered it unconstitutional, largely owing to mistrust in the government, distrust in the legislature executive complex when it comes to judicial appointment, rather than an attempt by judiciary to stall the evolution of constitution to reflect the changing times. Okay, so that is more likely to explain the particular example of NJC. But otherwise, if you look at, largely speaking, basic structure doctrine has been a success story. Okay, so that is the overall thing you can give. So I guess you got all the major components right, major structure right, examples right, and the keywords, the safety valve, the what you call judicially innovative doctrine, all of these things should be part of your answer. So I hope you got it right. So if all these components are there, out of 10, you can, and it's presented in a lucid manner, you are very likely to get 6 marks. Okay, it could go as high as 6 marks. Okay, thank you.